should be handled at the local level, and the Attorney General should withdraw his memo that started this whole thing off. Well, a couple days before Christmas, the Justice Department responded to us Republican members of the Judiciary Committee with a single-page letter. In that letter, the Department of Justice had nothing to say about why the FBI's Counterterrorism Division was involved in local school board matters. The Department of Justice just simply said, quote, "We're not going to withdraw the memo," end of quote. So, the feds may be keeping track of school board meetings, even if it creates a horrible, chilling effect at those meetings, and maybe even discourage people from coming to those meetings. And of course, the FBI looking over your shoulder would then have a chilling effect. Now, next week, the Senate Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing on domestic terrorism. And I hope the committee will be focusing on the serious threats facing our country. And I hope no one thinks the focus is going to be on our nation's parents. School boards have to be accountable to the parents and the taxpayers that they serve. Some school boards across the country are still shutting down classes, even though vaccines have been available for a long time, and dramatically reduce the chances of major illness to teachers. Meanwhile, millions of kids across the country are struggling to catch up. They're under enormous stress from being separated, one kid from their friends in the classroom or in the school building. Schools are seeing far more behavioral problems than they ever have before. Parents, then, are right to be concerned about these situations in their local schools, and it is their right to ask questions. They should be telling their school board districts that they want to see changes. But will they see changes, or will they be afraid to speak up at school board meetings? Will the FBI's Counterterrorism Division be keeping track of them as parents ask for changes from their school boards? The Department of Justice owes the American people a better answer than just a single-page letter that says nothing about why the FBI's Counterterrorism Division is involved in local school board matters. Now more than ever, parents should be their kids' strongest and the kids' best advocates. They have a God-given right to do so. And of course, the Justice Department ought to be doing everything it can to protect that constitutional right, not scare these parents out of exercising their constitutional rights. Attorney General Garland, then, should withdraw his memo, and he should take Congress's oversight and concerns for parental rights more seriously. Then on another matter, Mr. President, and the last issue I'm going to speak to, I want to visit with my colleagues on the continuing rise of violent crime across the country. We've all heard about the unprecedented 30% spike in murders that began in the summer of 2020. It continues to this very day. Over a dozen cities set new homicide records in the year just passed. The rise in violent crimes coincides with the defund the police movement and widespread depolicing. Cutting police budgets, combined with an anti-police sentiment fostered by local elected officials, has led to violence against our police officers. So we've seen a dramatic increase in on-duty deaths in the last year. So I want to quote the Fraternal Order of Police. That organization says 63 officers were murdered and 346 officers were shot. This organization also reported ambush-style attacks on law enforcement officers spiked 115% from 2020. The FBI has reported that unprovoked attacks against officers in which the officers had no official contact with the offender prior to the attack. And I want to quote, continued to outpace all circumstances of felonious officers' deaths, end of quote. Other forms of violent crime are also up as police are forced to retreat from the streets, including carjacking. Chicago saw 1,646 carjackings compared to 603 incidents in 2019. Minneapolis police reported carjackings shot up 537%. Carjackings in New Orleans have doubled since 2019. Oakland police say carjackings increased by 85%. Washington, D.C. reports a 141% increase from last year. In Louisville, Kentucky, carjackings have increased 185%. And similar reports come out of cities across the country. So, you see, criminals are emboldened by what's going on in our country, either through not showing respect for law enforcement or from efforts to cut the budgets of police departments. Flash mobs, another sort of new lingo that is just new because of the increase in costs. Flash mobs have made large organized smash and grab robberies a way of life in many cities. You've seen this on television. Break down the doors, go in with the hammers, steal everything you can, do it within 2 or 3 minutes and get out of there. So in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Houston, Atlanta, Sacramento, Baltimore, Las Vegas, and Seattle, groups of dozens make off with hundreds of thousands in merchandise. I've requested a briefing from the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security on these organized retail crime groups. This rise in violent crime ought to be unacceptable to everybody, and I'm stepping up to find solutions to these issues. This past December, Chairman Durbin of the Judiciary Committee held a field hearing in Chicago concerning gun trafficking and violent crime. I submitted questions for witnesses concerning the crisis level of carjackings, terrible attacks on police like the murder of Chicago police officer Ella French, and failed policies in blue cities that allow violent crime to continue. I hope the Judiciary Committee will hold a full committee hearing here in Washington on the spike in violence and the challenges that law enforcement is facing, including ineffective bail policies, cumbersome restraint on police officers, and join me in looking for ways that we can do more to combat violent crime, from carjackings to organized retail crime, to unspeakable rise in murders and murders of police officers. Let's have a hearing where we can learn more about these trends and how we can support police officers. Let's look for ways then that we can strengthen federal criminal laws and agencies to fight this violent crime. We can't continue down this path or it's going to lead to vigilante law enforcement. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
The Majority Leader,
Unanimous consent, the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to legislative session.
The questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Now I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 612.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will record the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Alan Davidson of Maryland to be Assistant Secretary for Communications and
Your motion. I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 612, Alan Davidson of Maryland, to be Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar 465.
The questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will record the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Transportation, Amitabha Bose of New Jersey to be Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 465, Amitabha Bose of New Jersey to be Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions filed today, January 5th, be waived.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. President. It was 2 years ago this month, I stood on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and was the first person to speak about a novel coronavirus, soon to be called COVID-19. 2 years ago, I'd been reading about this virus for several weeks, and something in my gut as a physician told me this was not going to be a common cold. I chatted with the CDC and I implored them to start doing research on the origins of the virus, asking was it from nature or from a laboratory, and that we needed to work on vaccines, therapeutics, and testing. As we all know, the development of a miracle vaccine, thanks to Operation Warp Speed, was successful. The testing, as we know, the CDC fumbled it, but the private sector saved us. And therapeutics, not so much. Therapeutics have never been a priority for this administration. As we return to our nation's capital, I'd venture to say that very few Americans didn't have somebody in their families catch Omicron. And my family was no different. We shared the same experience as millions of other Americans did. Despite being vaccinated, one of my loved ones with underlying health care conditions caught the Omicron virus. As I saw my loved one start having asthma, wheezing, short of breath, I did what every spouse would do and said, well, we need to go get testing. We need to talk to a doctor. So we drove to several testing sites, and we had the options of standing in line for 3 or 4 hours. With sick people, if we didn't have the Omicron, certainly would have by the time we left. We called around and finally were able to get an appointment the next day for testing. I'm not sure if you've ever seen a person with asthma, but you can see the distress in their face as they wheeze, as they become short of breath. And this is something I've seen all too familiar. I've taken care of thousands of women, pregnant women with asthma. been in the emergency room with them, having to admit them to the ICU, and I knew that was the road that we were headed to. I called around, hoping to find some monoclonal antibodies, a place where we could go and we could get monoclonal antibodies. And then there's new miracle antiviral therapeutics out there. I thought, well, maybe we could get those, but none were to be had. Watching my wife continue to suffer, I decided, I think we need to do some type of a telemedicine. So we called a doctor and set up a telemedicine visit, someone that had taken care of thousands of patients with the coronavirus. We did the appointment, and he prescribed ivermectin for her. After the first tablet, it was a miracle. Within an hour, her labored breathing had settled down. By the next day, her second dose, she was almost completely better, right before my eyes. Again, I remind everybody, it's been 2 years since this pandemic started, and we still have limited access to therapeutics. Again, as we all know, the Biden administration's approach to this is to put all their eggs in one basket. They believed in a one-size-fits-all approach. Vaccine mandates, masks, and testing was their prescription to get us through this pandemic. And all those have had a place, and all of them have had some successes. But when 1 million people in one day are testing positive, it's not surprising we can't keep up with the testing, and that's why we need therapeutics. In fact, the federal government has allocated over $80 billion for testing, $80 billion for testing, and only $15 billion for therapeutics. This is simply unacceptable. 2 years into this pandemic, and we've only spent $15 billion on therapeutics. The Biden administration should have already established an Operation Warp Speed approach to the development, manufacturing, and distribution of therapeutics. It just always seems like this administration has been a day late and a dollar short. For example, in mid-2021, we saw the Delta wave coming. We all knew it was coming. And we had real-world evidence in the summer of 2021 to suggest that a booster shot would be helpful for seniors and at-risk individuals. And it was in June of 2020 that I asked the CDC and the FDA to consider letting physicians meet with their patients and prescribe a booster ahead of the Delta wave. Again, summer of 2020. Unfortunately, the FDA waited until September the 22nd to approve the booster. Between June and September, more than 11,000 seniors died from breakthrough infections, while more than 230,000 people tested positive. No doubt, a booster and/or therapeutics could have made a big difference in these seniors' lives. It's easy to talk about the mistakes we've made with this virus. I want to spend a moment talking about solutions, though. We need to unleash our community health centers and our county health departments in this COVID-19 fight. They've been the backbone of vaccination and treatment for communicable diseases for decades. Once the Biden administration agrees to prioritize therapeutics, we need community health centers and county health departments to take over the telemedicine visits with trained nurses and implement treatment protocols across the United States. In Kansas alone, we have over 200 community health centers and clinics funded with federal dollars, along with over 100 local health departments that are accustomed to dealing with infectious diseases on a daily basis. These folks can implement these protocols based upon triaging at-risk individuals and starting early treatment. This will prevent many trips to the ER as well as hospitalization. Early treatment is what works. And finally, it just goes without saying that I trust these nurses to make necessary referrals to the emergency room. They can do this. How do I know it? I've worked with these nurses for 30 years. I helped sponsor, was the medical director for 3 county health departments for almost 30 years. They do an incredible job. They're well equipped to handle this effort, but they need the Biden administration to move on therapeutics and move fast. The medicines you could get for less than $100 can oftentimes prevent hospitalizations and ICU visits. We need to give doctors the options of using therapeutics along with steroids, anti-inflammatories, and other standard protocols that have been developed by these physicians who have treated literally thousands of COVID-19 patients. Certainly, if we had better access to monoclonal antibodies or these new miracle antiviral agents were available, we would use them as well. But please, let's empower physicians and these health departments and community health centers, these experienced nurses, to do their job. Time is precious. We cannot afford additional delays. We can't afford more confusion, more missed messaging, and more mismanagement. The Biden administration must let patients and physicians decide what's best in their unique healthcare situation, not somebody who's sitting on a throne in Washington, D.C., who seldom sees patients in the real world. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
We're not in a quorum? Quorum or no? Madam President,
Senator from Ohio.
I thank the presiding officer from Minnesota. I want to start by thanking my colleagues, Leader Schumer and Senator Klobuchar, for their work to honor the Capitol police officers who risked their lives to protect this country 1 year ago tomorrow. In the year since that dark day, we've learned more about all that those officers endured from the terrorists who stormed the Capitol, the racist slurs, the physical abuse, the mental injuries. We know things were so much worse than they appeared in the original reporting as more and more details have come out. These terrorists gouged someone's eyes out. They killed a Capitol police officer and injured 140 others. They threatened to kill the vice president. They brought a noose to the Capitol and paraded symbols of white supremacy. In fact, the people that broke in to the office upstairs from my office in the Capitol we have this on film, used flagpoles with Confederate flags and Trump flags attached to them. They brought equipment to take hostages. And it wasn't only Capitol police officers who endured this attack and put their lives on the line serving our republic on January 6th. Workers throughout the Capitol risked everything that day. Workers who do the radio and television broadcasts and work in the media center, workers who work the floor, workers who clean up, workers who do food service. They often don't get noticed like the Capitol support staff. Every day, Capitol janitorial and maintenance and other workers, essential workers, do their jobs with skill and dedication and dignity. They've shown up for work during this pandemic. Those workers were here on January 6th doing their job when the insurrectionists, when the rioters, when the, call it what you want, traitors, stormed this building, barging into this chamber, acting as if no one would ever hold them responsible or accountable for their violence, for their disregard for American values and for U.S. law. When their rampage was over, we know it was the largely black and brown custodial and maintenance workers who were left to restore dignity to the Capitol. Their work continued, their work, first of all, allowed us to continue to come back and continue our work at 8 o'clock that night, certifying the electoral votes and securing our democracy. As we know, domestic terrorists destroyed, black and brown custodians cleaned up, and maintenance workers, carpenters, painters, union members rebuilt. Today we honor them. Some of the most enduring, moving images of that day are the pictures of these workers sweeping up the mess that terrorists made in the People's House. That night after we voted, the senator from Minnesota was there. We were all there voting in this chamber. After the police had cleared, and the National Guard and the D.C. police, the Capitol Police, the Washington, others, after they cleared the terrorists out of this building, we came back at 8 o'clock and voted. I spent the night in the basement of my office. I live a 20-minute walk away. I really didn't want to walk home that night. But I walked around about midnight, walked around this building over in the House, the Senate. I saw the destruction. I saw the window right upstairs from me, the half-moon window, that terrorists with their flagpoles, with their Confederate flags and their Trump flags attached, broke through that window. When I was back there at midnight that night, already the cleanup from the custodians had started, cleaning up after they had been threatened, after they had been called names as black women, as immigrant women, after they had been called names by the terrorists. They were back at work cleaning up. Already a carpenter had taken a piece of cut a half-moon piece of plywood and nailed it to that window to keep safe this building and keep the elements out. We honor those people today. Some of the most, it's what service looks like. It's what love of country looks like. It's what the dignity of work looks like. It tells you a lot about what's wrong with our economy. These buildings, essential workers, the people who prepare the food, the people who clean up, the people who provide security, the essential workers, like so many of their fellow service workers around this country, they don't make a lot of money, they don't get much attention, they don't get much reward, they don't have much power. We simply don't value and respect all work the way we should. I think of the words of Dr. King. One of my favorite Dr. King quotes, "If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well." Dr. King said, "No work is insignificant. All labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance. No job," he later said, "no job with adequate compensation is menial." Or look at the words of Pope Francis a few days ago in his Christmas Eve address. Or think back 100 years, 120 years to Pope Leo, the Labor Pope, in Rerum Novarum, when he first introduced, at least in my view, first introduced the term, I assume in Latin, but the term dignity of work. Pope Francis, on his Christmas Eve address just a few days ago, said, "God reminds us of the importance of granting dignity to men and women through their labor, and also granting dignity to human labor itself. No work is those are Pope Francis's words. No work is insignificant. All labor has dignity. We ought to treat it that way, starting with honoring these workers." Last year, I joined my colleagues in a resolution to honor all the workers who risked their lives that day: custodians, maintenance workers, Capitol Police officers, journalists, the floor staff, the workers in our offices. All of them serve this country. All of them risk their safety to preserve our democracy. All of them deserve our gratitude. Today though, for tomorrow actually, but I will ask tonight, because my colleagues, because of Senator Isaacson's funeral, many will be there tomorrow. I asked my colleagues to join me and Senator Klobuchar and Schumer and Senators Casey and Booker in a resolution honoring specifically the Capitol janitorial and maintenance staff, all essential workers for their bravery and their service to our country on January 6th. One of my favorite parts of this job, and the presiding officer knows this because we've had these conversations, and her appreciation for work and for the people who work so hard and get so little. One of the joys of this job is to do what Abraham Lincoln used to say when his staff wanted him to stay in the White House and win the war and free the slaves and preserve the Union. Lincoln said, "No, I got to go out and get my public opinion bath." One of the joys of this job is to talk to the workers here just about their lives or about what happened January 6th. One custodial worker and I were talking, and she's been in this country for 30 years. She has been a citizen for 20 years and she's worked in this job for 30 years. She's been a citizen for 20 years. And she and a number of others were locked in a room where where terrorists were pounding on the walls and were screaming racial epithets and were making anti-immigrant, were screaming anti-immigrant, all of that. Yet she still works there. She was one of the ones that had to clean up after them. As I said, the terrorists destroyed, the black and brown maintenance workers cleaned up, and the union tradespeople rebuilt. This resolution that I am going to offer tomorrow, this resolution reaffirms the Senate's commitment to strengthening their rights as workers, providing support and resources to ensure their health, well-being, safety, protection from further attacks. Their support should include higher pay. It should include collective bargaining rights for all of them. It should include paid sick leave and vacation leave. It should include comprehensive health insurance with mental health resources. Don't think that many of these, you all understand, many of these police officers, many of these custodial workers, many of the movers and the plumbers and the others that were locked in their rooms or offices or buildings during this, many of them, I'm not a mental health expert at all, but many of them, I'm sure, suffer from issues of nightmares and other kinds of anxieties that we need to help them. I hope my colleagues will join me, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans, as members of this body. These workers serve us all. They allowed us to do our work for America that night after we essentially were run out of this room and were safe for several hours. They allowed us, because of their work, to come back here and be safe and do our jobs that we took an oath of office on January 3rd, 2021 to do. This building wouldn't function without them. No one should have to endure what they did at the hands of domestic terrorists. To the Capitol custodians and service workers who come to work in this building each day to ensure our democracy functions, thank you, thank you, thank you. I have this resolution honoring the Capitol's essential workers, applauding them for their service. I'd intended to try and pass this resolution by unanimous consent tomorrow, but I recognize that many of my colleagues are out of town at the funeral honoring one of the really good men or women, one of the good men that served in this body, Senator Johnny Isakson from Georgia. My hope is we can take this resolution up and pass this common sense resolution next week when we return. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm really pleased and honored to follow my colleague from Ohio and to join in supporting the resolution that he is offering to pay homage and to express gratitude to the essential workers in this building, in the Capitol complex, in this temple of democracy, for all they have done, not only on January 6th, but in the aftermath of that brutal assault on our democracy. We talk in abstracts now about the institution and the assault on this institution, but the lasting and enduring trauma for those workers that we will recognize in this resolution is tremendously important. It is important to them, but it is important to us as well, that we recognize our duty and our obligation to them for the dignity of their work and what they did to enable us to come back on that evening, January 6th, and do our duty, and do it in a bipartisan way, coming together on that day. We were all witnesses to a brutal crime. We were all witnesses to an insurrection and a riot that stands as a dark and terrible milestone. The anniversary tomorrow of probably the most abhorrent attack on our democratic institutions, and all of us who were witnesses can never forget the horror of that day, the sheer physicality of the attack, the blood in the hallways, the sights and sounds of rioters with bats and pipes bearing Trump banners and Confederate flags and seeking to do physical harm to us, to kill the vice president. That kind of physical, brutal, cruel attack with the hope, in fact, intent of killing and injury had its effect. In fact, people died. Our Capitol Police bravely defended us with determination and courage, and so did many other heroes of that day in the National Guard and the DC Police. But let us never forget that that mob was called here, to this very chamber, by the former president in a cynical bid to keep himself in power through a coup that would subvert the will of the people on Election Day. And we were here. We were all standing and then sitting in our desk when we were rushed from this chamber because of the threat of physical assault on us. In the end, their efforts were thwarted. Congress certified the election results that night as planned. We were undeterred, undaunted by the violent and deadly attack on the Capitol and our democracy. But that day was not a one-off. It was not an isolated or aberrant incident. In fact, it was a symptom and a symbol of a deeper destructive violence, of violent extremism, a virus of domestic terrorism that continues to infect our nation. In fact, the most persistent and lethal threat to our national internal security, according to the intelligence community and the FBI, is violent extremism and white supremacy. That attack left scars and wounds that remain unhealed, the lives that were lost, and many of our staff, many of those maintenance workers, many of the cafeteria and janitorial staff struggle with lingering trauma from the violence that they faced on that day. The attack reminded us of how fragile and endangered our democratic institutions are when our leaders, when we as leaders fail to protect them. The mob that assaulted our Capitol were fueled by the big lie, the baseless falsehood that massive fraud occurred during the 2020 election. That big lie was propagated and supported by the president and his enablers, and they have continued to fuel those delusions. Donald Trump has incited continually the kind of falsehoods that lead to a sharp rise in threats against lawmakers in the Capitol here and a higher comfort level with violence at every level, in school boards, in state houses. The big lie has now become a pretense. It has become a pretense for some Republican leaders in state governments across the country to pass legislation, making it harder to vote, meaning that fewer people have fewer times and fewer places to cast their votes. At least 19 states have passed 34 new laws that restrict voting rights based on that big lie, the bogus, false claims of fraud. And Republicans in a number of states are vesting the power to overturn election results, literally to deny the results of the vote count rather than respecting the will of the people, whether it is the vote canvass boards or legislative committees or other state officials having the power to strike down and overturn the results by refusing to certify them or literally disregarding them. All of this voter suppression is poisonous. It is toxic to our democracy. And we have an obligation on this solemn anniversary of that horrific attack to recommit ourselves to holding accountable those domestic terrorists and violent extremists who stormed the Capitol and hunted us, lawmakers and others, ransacked the halls that we regard with so much reverence, defaced and debased not just the building, but the concept of democracy. And we should pursue not only prosecutions against the 700 or 1,000 people who can be held criminally responsible for defacing the Capitol or illegally entering or other acts of violence, but everyone who aided and abetted them. They must be held accountable, no matter what their rank or their office, no matter how high the facts and the law will go. I urge the Department of Justice to pursue them, to prosecute them, to make sure that they are held accountable. We also need to fortify those institutions, and that's why passing the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act Advancement Act have to be among our priorities, and changing the rules to make that possible. My colleagues and I will bring to the Senate floor for a vote in the coming weeks, no later than January 17th, those measures and an effort to change the rules to enable their passage. We need to do whatever is necessary to pass those measures, including limiting the filibuster. There is a direct through line from the big lie and the January 6th assault, incited by Donald Trump, to violent extremism and domestic terrorism, to voter suppression, and the overturning of elections, eventually to the destruction of our democracy. During the peaceful transition of power that eventually did take place last January, President Biden reminded us that a better world is not something that is given to us. It requires hard work. Unity is not inevitable. It is achievable through what we do to make it possible. Democracy is not a spectator sport. The values and norms and institutions of our democracy are fragile, as threatened now as they are precious, and they depend on people fighting for them in times of adversity, and truly now we are in a time of adversity. What haunts me as I think back on January 6th is how close we came to losing our democracy, how close we came to shattering the traditions and norms, much as the windows of this building were shattered, and how a few people continued to believe that they could demagogue and enable Trump to stage that coup. There's no forgetting what some of our colleagues did. There's no denying it, but we have sought to work together because we come here and we are sent here for a common purpose, which is to meet the needs of Americans, especially in a time of pandemic and economic hardship. This past year has truly been one of hardship and heartbreak for so many. And as we think back to that day a year ago, we need to redouble our determination to hold dear the democratic values and institutions that mean elected representatives truly represent the people. That is what elections do. That is why every vote should count and every vote must count. And that is the purpose of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We have our part to do. We need to do it. And I hope my colleagues will not only relive and remember, but act on it. The common purpose of that day when we came back to count the vote, to make sure that we can come together again, not just to honor the people who enabled us to do it, but also to honor the people of America who elect us to do it. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. Why January 6th? Why were thousands of Trump supporters here in Washington on that specific date, January 6th? They were here on January 6th because that was the last possible day that Donald Trump and his followers could overturn the election in which Joe Biden had just beaten the sitting president soundly, 81 million votes to 74 million votes. The gap in the Electoral College was much bigger on a percentage basis, 306 to 232. But Trump and his followers decided that they were not going to just give up power just because their candidate lost an election. And their decision to put power ahead of the rule of law is, frankly, totally understandable. Over the course of human existence, thousands of second-place finishers, either through election or by the dynamics of power succession, have refused to bend to the rules. Most recently, Russia briefly flirted with democracy until Vladimir Putin and his cronies rigged the rules to set him up in power permanently. And throughout history, many slighted princes or generals have just chosen to seize power through force or coercion if they couldn't get it through the standing rules. Wanting power and being willing to do anything to get power, it's as old as civilization. And that's why all those people broke into the Capitol a year ago tomorrow. They were called to Washington by President Trump to pressure Congress and state legislators and Vice President Pence to suspend the rules of succession, void the election, and install Donald Trump as president, even though he lost. Let's not pretend that anything else happened that day. Senator Cruz and Hawley and many, many other Republicans were, on January 6th, trying to get Congress to delay the certification of electors to give Trump more time to overturn the will of the voters. The rioters came to the Capitol to use violence as a last resort to try to pressure Congress to adopt the Cruz-Hawley plan. They stormed the building, and many of them were explicit when they were here that day, that they were inside the building to support President Trump, to support Senator Cruz. By the end of the day, dozens were killed or badly injured. It wasn't a spontaneous, random act of mass violence. It was a coordinated attempt to use violence, or at least the threat of violence for many, to void the 2020 election and install Donald Trump as an unelected leader of the United States of America. History has seen this play a million times before. But I think here in the Senate, we often get lulled into a little bit of a sense of complacency because the last vestiges of the pre-Trump era Republican Party still exist here in the Senate. In the Senate, only 7 Republicans voted for Senator Cruz and Hawley's attempt to void Joe Biden's victory. And Senator McConnell and some others here said the right things that day and in the days afterwards. Behind closed doors, many of our veteran Republican colleagues often whisper to us how awful and vulgar the Trump rioters are and how dearly they support the rule of law. But almost never do those Republican colleagues say those things out loud. Because the new mainstream of the Republican Party, the Trump Republican Party, does not believe that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. Pick your conspiracy theory, but 7 out of 10 Republicans, literally tens of thousands of Americans, believe that somehow Pakistani intelligence operatives or Italian satellites or Venezuelan communists were involved in secretly switching millions of votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. But maybe more importantly, what leads these Republicans to believe these wild conspiracy theories is a more insidious belief. A belief that if a Democrat wins an election, it must be, by definition, illegitimate. That's why this many Republicans believe Joe Biden didn't win, even though they have zero evidence to back up this claim. They don't need evidence because they just believe that Democrats are evil, that Democrats are illegitimate in governance. And if Democrats win, it just cannot be allowed to stand. Defeating Democrats is, for the Trump Republican Party, more important than maintaining democracy. We know this because some of the most popular and revered national Republicans are calling openly for the suspension of democracy, if democracy keeps electing Democrats. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene called for states with Republican governors to disallow people from voting if they showed an inclination to support Democrats. Our colleague, Senator Rand Paul, said efforts to convince people to vote, if those votes resulted in Democrats winning, should be illegal. Sensible Senate Republicans, the ones that whisper the sensible things quietly to us here on the floor of the Senate chamber, they'll claim that Marjorie Taylor Greene is an outlier, that she's a fringe character. But she's exactly the opposite. She's the mainstream. She doesn't believe Joe Biden won the 2020 election, just like 7 out of 10 Republican voters. The fact that she's willing to say the quiet things out loud, it doesn't make her fringe, it makes her royalty. The best attended Republican event in my state since the 2020 election was an event headlined by Marjorie Taylor Greene. She and Rand Paul and their ilk are the Republican Party right now. They are the healthy trunk of the tree. Sensible Senate Republicans who believe Joe Biden is a legitimate president are the dead limbs, bound to fall off soon in a slight wind. The mainstream of today's Republican Party believes that beating Joe Biden and other Democrats is just more important than preserving democracy. So that's why they are methodically working to clean up their mistakes from 2020. They couldn't declare Joe Biden's win illegitimate because they just weren't ready on January 6th. That's what January 6th was about, an attempt to postpone the certification of electors so that they could get ready. Well, in 2022 and 2024, they're going to be ready. At the heart of this plan is an attempt to just make it a whole lot harder for Democrats to vote by eliminating voting sites in Democratic neighborhoods or eliminating days to vote, days that typically Democrats vote on. But Republicans are also preparing a secret weapon, a backup plan if on election night their attempts to depress Democratic turnout don't work out and a Democratic candidate for governor or for Senate or for president still wins. And this backup plan is all about changing who counts the votes. It used to be that even in Republican majority states, Democrats had a role in counting the votes, either through bipartisan panels or through the ability for cities and counties to choose their own election officials, which often meant that in Democratic counties, you had Democrats in charge of counting votes, and in Republican counties, you had Republicans in charge of counting votes. This has been a long-standing foundation of our democracy, making sure that no one party had the monopoly on vote counting. If both parties are engaged in the process, then there's just a lot more incentive for both sides to play it safe and play it straight. But no more. In Republican-controlled state after state, the rules are being changed to put Republicans, and only Republicans, in charge of counting the votes, and more consequently, deciding which votes count. And Trump and his followers are making sure that only Republicans that are 100% loyal to Trump will be the chosen few Republicans in charge of vote counting. Everybody's heard that phone call from 2020 in which President Trump personally lobbies the Georgia Secretary of State to disqualify just enough Democratic votes in order to shift the state's electors to Trump. I just want to find 11,780 votes, Trump pleads in that phone call. And during that hour-long call, he makes it exactly clear what he wants. He wants 11,780 or more Democratic votes to be disqualified through vague, made-up claims of fraud in order to flip the election. He tells you exactly what he wants on that phone call. Votes to be disqualified on zero basis of fraud in order to flip the election to him. The new state laws and the purge of straight shooters, like the Georgia Secretary of State from the party, will make sure that in 2022 or 2024, if an election is close enough to flip to Republicans, the obstacles that were in place in 2020 will be gone. Now, I know that every Republican senator, and even a few Democratic senators, think this scenario that I just outlined is hyperbolic. They think it's a scare tactic. But why would you think that? Trump and his allies aren't even trying to hide what they did or what they're doing. Trump lost the election. He lost the election by 7 million votes, and he didn't care. He did everything in his power, including using violence, to try to stay in power despite the fact that he lost. Since then, he has cheerled all these changes in state laws. Do any of you really think that he's doing this because he believes in good governance or clean elections? Of course not. He's told you in words and deeds over and over what his goal is, and his goal is to achieve power, whether or not he actually wins the election. He's not hiding it. His supporters, leaders of the Republican Party, are now openly calling for states to strip from Democrats, and Democrats only, the right to vote or the right to campaign for election. This is all happening in front of our eyes, out in the open, right now. And only we, the 100 of us, have the ability to stop this. January 6th was just a preview. It was what happened because Trump and his minions hadn't done the necessary planning ahead to steal the election. They panicked and they brought violence upon this building. They may not need a physical rebellion in 2022 or 2024 because they will have changed the rules to make sure that Republicans loyal to Trump are installed in power regardless of whether they win or lose the election. None of us are helpless here in the United States Senate. We can pass laws that take away from states the power to disenfranchise any voters or the ability to put only one party in charge of vote counting. A few of my Democratic Senate colleagues think that they're saving the Senate by preserving Republicans' right to stop these reforms. They're wrong. If we don't take steps right now to stop Trump's plan, there won't be a Senate left to protect. That's not hyperbole. If the loser of an election for the United States Senate gets seated as a member of this body in 2023, then our democracy is effectively dead. It's time we started actually listening to what Trump Republicans are telling us over and over again out loud that they are getting ready to do. They have made their choice, and they've chosen power over democracy. I get it. It's always easier to do nothing and hope that the threat will just go away. Just shut the door, box your ears, cover your eyes, hope for the best. But we're the United States Senate. We're the ones that are put on the watch. We're the ones that are supposed to meet the threat head on and stop it. I yield the floor. Madam President.
The senator from Connecticut.
First, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Second, I'd ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Con Res 25, which was received today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 25, authorizing the use of the rotunda of the Capitol for the lying in state of the remains of the Honorable Harry Mason Reed, Jr., a senator from the state of Nevada.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent the concurrent resolution be agreed to, that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Next, I would ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Con Res 26, which was received today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 26, providing for the use of the catafalque situated in Exhibition Hall of the Capitol Visitor Center in connection with memorial services to be conducted in the rotunda of the Capitol for the Honorable Harry Mason Reed, Jr., a senator from the state of Nevada.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the concurrent resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
And finally, I'd ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10:30 a.m. Thursday, January 6th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed, that upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Bose nomination. Further, that at 12 noon there be a moment of silence in observance of the events of January 6, 2021. Finally, that the cloture motions filed during today's session ripen at 5:30 p.m. on Monday, January 10th.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I'd ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order under the provisions of S-Res 484.
Under the previous order and pursuant to Senate Res 484, the Senate stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, January 6, 2022, and does so as a further mark of respect to the late Johnny Hardy Isaacson, former senator from Georgia.